Hello, everyone, and welcome to MLE International's second webinar of the year. I'm Carol Benson, founder and co-director of MLE International with Erina.
Hi, I'm Erina. I am a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Notre Dame and also supporting MLE International as a co-director as well. Welcome.
MLE International is a network of scholars and practitioners involved in research and technical assistance to implementers of multilingual education. And we're still planning to incorporate as a nonprofit organization to support implementation, especially in low-income contexts and countries. So for this webinar, we'll do it the same as we did it in January. We'll ask you all to stay muted during the presentation. We'll keep the chat for questions, and we'll monitor those and try to give you opportunities to ask them yourselves at the end. We have 45 minutes for the presentation and 45 minutes for the discussion if we need them. And we're recording this session. I hope I lost track. Yes, it's recording. Great. So without any more introduction, here is the second webinar of the year about language and education policy and implementation. And welcome, Erina and TJ, and I'll let you introduce yourselves.
Great. Thanks so much, Carol. My name is TJ D'Agostino. I'm an assistant professor of the practice at the University of Notre Dame in the Keough School for Global Affairs, and was the lead PI of the Language of Instruction Transition in Education Systems Study, or LITES for the acronym, which was a USAID-funded study between 2022 and 2024, barely into 2025 before we lost USAID. This data is coming from that study, and it's been a pleasure to collaborate very closely with Erina Iwasaki on a lot of this work, and we're looking forward to sharing a little bit more of the story of this kind of final, what we hope will be the final paper synthesizing the cross-national evidence from one of the main research questions from that study. Erina?
And hello again. I am Erina Iwasaki, postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Notre Dame, and I joined the University of Notre Dame because of the LITES study in April of 2024. And it's been also a great pleasure working on this. My research was focusing on policy entrepreneurs, the role of policy entrepreneurs in L1-based policy change and adoption. And so the LITES study felt a very good continuity to continue this and to work also very closely with TJ on this. And we're very excited to present today the results of our cross-national study. So the title of this study is Why is L1-based multilingual education policy adopted in some countries and not others? So we're looking at the variation between countries that have adopted or have not adopted or even reversed their policies. And I think most of you are familiar here, but L1 means first language based, the language that the students understand best, and MLE means multilingual education. So we're looking at first language based multilingual education policy. So many of you here present here already know there is well-established evidence for L1-based MLE in research. Research has shown that first language-based MLE generates large gains in academic performance in L2 acquisition, it improves school attendance, and there's better retention rates for girls. It also generates long-term cost efficiency. Research also has shown that dual language programs and late exit model tend to have produce better results than early exit models. So this is really, we have a very well-established evidence base. But despite the strong evidence, we see that only a few low and middle income countries have embraced L1-based MLE in practice, and which means that L2, meaning a second dominant language, tends to be, the education system tends to prefer the L2 immersion or submersion model in low and middle income countries. So because of this, around 37% of students globally, and most of them are in sub-Saharan Africa, are taught in a language that they do not speak or understand well. the key for this study was to ask ourselves, then why is the adoption of L1-based MLE, which is an evidence-based approach, so low in low and middle income countries? We posit that this is not a pedagogical or programmatic question, but rather a political one. And when we looked at the literature related to the politics of language and education policy, we saw that research has overwhelmingly focused on reasons of resistance to the use of L1s. So we have studies cited here that emphasizes dominant language ideologies, colonial hierarchies, elite interest in maintaining linguistic privilege, and neoliberal discourses that valorize global languages. Other research have attributed this resistance to the use of L1s to a technical and administrative complexity, especially when implementing at scale, and we have a series of studies that are showing this. But despite this complexity, a growing number of countries have adopted and scaled L1-based MLE policies or have switched policies in recent years. And we have examples of Cambodia, Mali, Senegal, Mozambique, Ethiopia, South Africa, Rwanda, Ghana, the Philippines. And we found that these resistance accounts, while helpful to understand why L1-based are not adopted, it really fails to explain the variation, the different cases that we see, the countries that have adopted, that have not adopted, the countries that have switched policy. So it really fails to explain the variation in policy adoption. And when we looked at literature explaining variation in L1-based MLE adoption, we've seen that there's some emerging work that has moved beyond these resistant-based accounts by examining the role of policy entrepreneurs, coalition, and institutional actors in enabling policy change. And some of you may already be familiar with Timo and Terrell's work on the above, side, below actors. And these studies, or the scholarship is really useful in shifting attention towards agency and political process. But what we found is that perhaps it doesn't yet produce a consolidated causal framework that is capable of explaining the different variations in political prioritization. So this is where our study, because we look at this from a political lens, a political science lens, we've approached this as an agenda setting question. So what do we mean by agenda setting? Well, political scientists describe agenda setting as the failure or success in generating political priority for a policy. So in our case is L1-based MLE. So how does L1-based MLE get adopted or not on national reform agendas? So this is the lens that we'll be using in this study. And hand over to TJ.
Thanks, Erina. So the country cases in the LITES study there were 6 countries that were participating in the LITES study, 5 in sub-Saharan Africa and 1 in Southeast Asia. And they were Senegal, Mali, Mozambique, Kenya, Rwanda in sub-Saharan Africa, and the Philippines in Southeast Asia. And that gave us some linguistic and historical and policy diversity, which was great for being able to analyze the research. So if you want to click through the 3 different ones here, Erina, thank you so much. So basically, in this kind of research, which is often called causal qualitative research, it's important to define the parameters of the cases that we're looking at, and people call these scope conditions, and they're basically the attributes that are common to all of the cases. So all 6 countries shared all of these conditions, and why that's important is we're not necessarily saying this is how things always work, but they work in countries like this, we think. So briefly, all of our country contexts were post-colonial. They were linguistically diverse societies. There was linguistic pluralism, often with a local or one or more local language or national language and an international or post-colonial language. Sometimes there were languages of wider communication like Kiswahili in Kenya and Filipino or Tagalog in the Philippines. Also, they're low and middle income countries, so there's some resource constraints that affect how policies work and how policymakers think about their work. And then there are a few kind of enabling conditions that were common that we think helped make L1-based multilingual education more likely or more possible, and some conditions that were resistant. So that similar to the research that Erina was just mentioning, a lot of the patterns from that research we saw in our data as well in these country contexts. So in terms of an enabling condition, all of the countries had like L1-based multilingual education was on the table. It was a legitimate policy option and category that had been discussed, debated, and was at least codified to some degree in some kind of legal recognition. So whether that be the language being the local languages being recognized in the Constitution, or even policies being in favor of L1 use in schools being on the books, but not necessarily implemented at all, there's some kind of formal recognition that this is something worth considering on the policy agenda. And so that's an enabling condition. And then the constraining conditions, what we're calling structural headwinds, were the following. In every country context, there was concern about the complexity or the difficulty of implementing a L1-based MLE, often, especially in linguistically heterogeneous contexts with many languages. Um, Concerns about cost, concerns about just like the complexity of managing curricula across those languages, et cetera. And then really kind of two factors. The role of languages and language hierarchies in these post-colonial contexts led certain percentages of the population, often elites, sometimes also parents, to really favor L2 acquisition as kind of a social prestige or as a perceived vehicle for social mobility. And that often led to some degree of resistance. And this kind of was also mirrored in the structures of the education systems themselves. So in every one of the country cases, the education systems ultimately expect children to be able to, at a certain point in time in their educational trajectory, to learn exclusively in a second language. So whether that happened in first grade in Rwanda now, or in fourth grade according to the official policy in Kenya, or in middle school, eventually, or lower secondary school, eventually the systems are requiring some kind of a transition to second language as the language of instruction. And so therefore the system kind of is oriented towards that to a degree. Often that pushes and is at least keeping this idea of L2 immersion as a policy alternative very live in the debate. And this is often supported by some myths or assumptions that L2 immersion is the most expedient way of acquiring a second language, and other narratives about like the importance of second languages for economic competitiveness, either of the country or of individuals, et cetera. So these are the scope conditions. They're common in all of the cases. We say them here because they are also not necessarily explaining the variation. To understand why some then prioritize L1-based MLE and others do not, we need to look at other factors in the story because these are common to all 6 cases. Okay, next slide, please. So this is the model that we're going to be talking about today, and we're just going to present it at the beginning, and then we're going to tell you a little bit more about how we constructed it and how we tested it. But I'll briefly just run us through it to give you a sense of what we're thinking. And when we say the causal model, this is a summary of what we think is explaining this variation. This is kind of our key idea, our set of ideas about what we think is happening that we're then going to test and see to what extent does the data support this. So first, on the far right is the outcome of interest. This is the degree to which L1-based multilingual education is a political priority on the national agenda. And when it is, kind of by the definitions I'll share with you in a minute, it tends to become enacted and implemented and resourced and moves forward. So the key is, are decision makers prioritizing it and then beginning to act upon it? And so we're really looking at this, are they prioritizing it question, and to what degree, yes or no? And what we're suggesting here is in the level 1 general buckets, these 3 conditions, or sometimes people call them causal mechanisms, these 3 key conditions lead to prioritization. Especially the and there is important, especially when we think maybe perhaps only when they work together do they produce that outcome. So I'm going to run through these really quickly. Political mobilization, feasibility, and agenda salience and attention. We've come up with these little metaphors to describe what they are. Political mobilization is like the push. To what degree is this being pushed onto the agenda through things like advocacy? The feasibility is like a clear path. To what degree is there confidence that there is a model that can work and that's feasible to implement. And then agenda salience and attention is like the heat. To what degree is this issue kind of catching fire or boiling up in the context? Are people really paying attention to it and talking about it in a way that's gaining traction? So push, path, and heat. When those three things combine, we think prioritization is achieved and things move in terms of policy action. Now, lastly, I'll just say very briefly, the level twos, we think these are kind of generalizable categories. The push, heat, and sorry, push, path, and heat. But how you get to push or how push is created in context can vary. In all of our cases, we saw the push created by national leaders. So usually civil society leaders, sometimes government officials, but really kind of national elites were the ones advocating and really pushing this on the agenda. But it doesn't necessarily, we don't think that is always the case or necessarily always the case. There are examples from other countries and other policy issues where a grassroots movement of student protests in Chile led to policy change in their school choice policy. And it was really grassroots mobilization, not elites that were creating the push. In another context, I can think of a policy change in Uganda in their secondary education kind of public-private partnership policy that was really pushed by the World Bank to elites in the government, and then that led to a policy adoption. So you can see transnational actors creating the push, or maybe local grassroots things creating the push. There could be multiple paths to mobilization. Mobilization is the essential. Level two is the particular. It can change, but we always found these factors, proofs of concept, were like pilot projects that then had a good evaluation, but domestic pilot projects. So they were pilots in the country that people could point to. And then focusing events are kind of different things that create like some symbolic interest in something. Often they're actual events like a major workshop or a conference. Sometimes they can be artifacts like a research article or a research report that shines a light on an issue and really gains attention. Or they can even be events that are disconnected to the policy, but like a crisis or something happens that suddenly shines a light on an issue and people pay a lot more attention to it. So these are the kind of particular stories that led to the creation of mobilization, feasibility, and attention. Again, we think there could be alternatives, but these were the actors in the 6 cases that we found. Okay, go ahead, Erina. Thanks. So I'm going to try to be brief, but we have a kind of a complex methodology to describe. There's like 4 major steps in the process and that led to these study results. So I'll give a highlight here. We could always return to this later if folks are interested. But we first began with the very in-depth individual country case studies in each of the 6 cases. And we used a method that's common in political science and kind of emerging in some other circles in sociology called process tracing. And it's considered a causal qualitative method. It's also called theory testing. So you start with a set of theorized possible causes from the research literature. And we used a framework from Shiffman and Smith in 2007 that gave 18 possible causal factors that they argue typically create political prioritization on policy agendas. And we tested to see if they were there in our cases and how strong the evidence was that they were there. Often people compare process tracing to like detective work or the way like lawyers or prosecutors would think about trying to prove something in the court of law beyond a reasonable doubt. So the idea is to think of what is the likelihood and based on the evidence that this causal factor is producing or helping to produce this outcome. And similar to in a court case, you're not just describing that A is present and B is present, but you're really trying to capture how and why A is affecting B. So things like when we think of like trying to prove a murder trial, you need motive, you need murder weapon, you need fingerprints on the murder weapon, you can't have an alibi. So it's not just seeing that this person was a suspect and they were maybe present at the scene. You need a lot more evidence that all points to a credible causal story that includes why and how it happened to really be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that this was active in the context. So it's a very similar way of working in terms of the kind of evidence we were collecting. Okay, next. So other thing that's really important in these cases, you first have to define the outcome. So what is the outcome? This is like, did a murder happen? Or what are we trying to prove is the outcome here? And then how is that outcome created? So Schiffman defines prioritization based on three criteria: whether political leaders are talking about the issue a lot in public and private, so we're calling that political speech; whether the issue or the policy is being implemented actively and that there's like a concerted and major effort to put it into practice, so policy enactment; and then whether money is being devoted to this, so to what degree is it getting budgetary allocation or financial attention. And if all those three are high and present, then we would say it's a high priority. And if none of them are present or if they're quite weak, we would say it's maybe a low priority or a moderate priority. So this is the distribution of our country cases and whether they were high or low priorities. Importantly, we looked at the past roughly 15 years in each country. And in a couple of the country cases, the politics switched maybe multiple times. So in both Rwanda and the Philippines, the prioritization changed at different time periods. And without getting into a ton of detail, I'll just say that between 2013 and 2019 in Rwanda, they were using an L1-based policy until fourth grade, Kinyarwanda until fourth grade, and then transitioned to English. And then they switched in 2019 to an English immersion policy. Similarly, in the Philippines, they were using scaling and implementing a national MTB MLE policy or an L1-based policy from 2009 to roughly 2023. And then again, also in the Philippines, beginning in 2023, there was the passage of a bill in both the House and Senate to overturn the MTB MLE policy. And then there was a consolidation bill in 2024 that became passed into law in 2024 that essentially, for the most part, overturned the MTB MLE policy. So in each case, we see some dynamism in those two contexts. And so high at one point, low at another point. In the other context, it was more stable policy trajectory. And so the outcome is kind of stable, either high or low. In terms of the data sources that we collected, there was really three. And this is what we used to try to amass the strength of causal evidence for any of these given causal factors. And the first part was a document review that looked at both kind of maybe three types of documents: research literature, more published kind of reports from NGOs or other national kind of entities, but not necessarily peer reviewed. And then also kind of media documents or media reports. For example, we found really helpful the congressional testimony in the Philippines of the congressional hearings that were evaluating the MTB MLE policy. It was a really clear way to see how decision makers were thinking about things. Secondly, we hosted in each country context a systems thinking workshop with 50 kind of key leaders from within the policy community around language and education policy. And it was a very participatory workshop with a lot of breakout sessions where we took notes and collected artifacts from the discussions, essentially about how policy implementation and policy prioritization were working for these policies in their context. And lastly, we conducted about 10 to 15 interviews per country. And the key thing to mention here is in process tracing, it matters a lot more who you interview than how many interviews you conduct, because this is similar to like who you would put on the stand to try to make the case for a court case. And so people that were like eyewitnesses or the victim themselves, so people that were the decision makers themselves or have deep knowledge of the context, are going to be able to give you the most compelling evidence about what happened with policy changes. So you really want people that have firsthand knowledge of the case and the story who can explain what happened. And so we often got like former ministers of education or current senior leaders in the ministry or other civil society actors who were very involved throughout the causal story of what was happening in the policy environment. Okay, next. So then once we had all of this assembled, we started the cross case comparison. And there's a multi-step process here that began with something called set theory, or also it's like very similar to logic in philosophy, which is to try to see if the evidence is pointing to necessary or sufficient causes or no real pattern in the causes across the country cases. And we use this thing called a 2x2 table, or sometimes called a contingency table. And this is an example of one. So proofs of concept were one of the 18 factors that we tested. And this is, you see on the left-hand column whether it's a high or low political outcome, and then whether or not proofs of concept were strong when present or weak or absent. And along the top column, for all the high priority cases, you see that every one of our high priority cases had a proof of concept. What that suggests is that proofs of concept may be necessary because there's nothing in that first box. There was never a case with an absent proof of concept that was also a high priority. It may be necessary. I'm not 100% sure, but it's pointing towards that. And then whether it's sufficient, you have to look at the bottom case. And here, Rwanda, the presence of Rwanda, there was a strong proof of concept in Rwanda, but it didn't push things to a high political priority. And that tells us that proofs of concept seem pretty important, but not definitively. The evidence is not telling us that this is always a sufficient cause. In other words, every time there was a proof of concept that didn't guarantee that priority was achieved, at least not by itself. And so these 2 by 2 tables can be useful. This is telling us proofs of concept are important. It usually leads to one or the, like, it usually correlates with this kind of high priority or low priority, but there's at least one outlier there of Rwanda that's suggesting to us maybe it's not sufficient by itself. Okay, so we did this for each of the 18 tables. And then and I'll maybe go ahead one more thing. And then we analyzed all that information and reread all the case studies and went through a process of trying to essentially draw the causal model that was appearing across all the cases based upon all this evidence. That was a bit of a messy process. We'll show in a minute. And then we kind of refined that model from an initial picture to a cleaner, tighter theory. And I want to just show you that in a second. So Erina and I, so go ahead to the messy model. Erina and I basically spent a few hours in a room with a whiteboard and drew and erased and argued and tried to come up with this. This is the first version of the model that we initially came up with. And what I won't spend a ton of time on this, but just tell you on how this is the same and if essentially the same or very similar to the model that we ended with that's much cleaner. We pulled the scope conditions that were common to all of these out of the model to clean it up. But category creation was the same as this idea that I mentioned at the beginning of like L1-based MLE being a legitimate policy option. There was some, it was recognized as a possible policy in every one of the contexts. So we pulled that into scope conditions and then we moved it out of the model. The second major change that we did is these moderators at the bottom. These were causes that we had good data on in at least some cases as mattering to some degree, but they tended not to matter in most cases. Maybe they were really important in one case, but they weren't consistently important, or they were kind of like supporting cast. They were like supporting actors, not the lead actors in the causal story. So we could see their relevance, but they weren't really doing the heavy lifting, so to speak, of the causal story. They were kind of floating around there. And so we ended up dropping them from the causal model and saying, not that these are unimportant, but they're just not the main important thing. So we're not going to test them in this rigorous way that we're going to test the other parts of the model. And then what was left is essentially these 4 boxes: leadership, proofs of concept, focusing events, and policy community. And we ended up kind of collapsing the last 2, focusing events and policy community cohesion, into the bottom causal condition in our model. So that became the model. Those 3 things plus the outcome. So if you go to the next page, when we refined, and this was both basically talking to other academics, sharing our model, getting feedback, arguing about it more whiteboard, and reading the literature on the theory and just thinking more deeply about the cases, and we came up with this refined version. Again, continuity with the last version and with the data, but a cleaner, simpler model to test. And so then the last part is actually testing this, and that's what we'll get into now and give you the story about that as the last part of our presentation. So I'm going to give the high level kind of synthesis of the data, and then Erina will give you this kind of the last step of our process after what I'll show you here is to then say, okay, we see that at a high level, this seems to be working in a certain way, but if we go back to the detailed narratives, can we see that it always still holds up, or are there important nuances and deviances from the story? So I'm going to give you the high level. Erina will tell you the stories. What we see here is the pattern in the data that suggests the following: that political mobilization, feasibility, and agenda salience and attention. The check marks here suggest that they were present in that case. If there's no check mark, they were absent. And then the little arrow to the right is showing that this is like a causal connection. And then this is the outcome of prioritization in that context. And then we give a definition of like how we know that that was a high priority. So in all of the high priority cases, you see that they all have check marks in all three boxes. That suggests that that each of these things, well, also when at least one of the boxes are absent or more, they are a low priority. And we think that you can go to the next slide now, Rena. We think that this essentially points to at least the likelihood that of the following kind of conclusions, that each condition, again, mobilization, feasibility, and attention, that each condition is individually necessary. If any of them are missing, the political outcome won't happen. So if you take one out of the story, that it doesn't go. So they're individually necessary, but also, and importantly, that all three together are jointly sufficient, which means other things don't necessarily need to be part of the story. If you have these three, these are the essential conditions, and things will move. And again, this is what we're theorizing, and our data, this is the language you're supposed to use in this kind of research method, is to say that the data suggests that this is a plausible theory. In other words, the data is aligning to this, and that's what we saw in that last slide. Okay, over to you, Rena.
Thank you, TJ. So as TJ was saying, you saw with the synthesis table, the basically the overview picture of how these conditions, why these three conditions matter in order to produce high priority. And when one or two or all of them are missing, then we do not have high prioritization of L1-based MLE. So now coming back to the within case analysis, meaning in each of these cases, I want to spend a little more time explaining how and why it happens on the ground or within each case. So you get a little more of a taste of, of what's actually happening in real life. So the first condition is political mobilization. So our data, the evidence showed that national leadership drives political mobilization. And so by national leadership, we're referring here to national policy entrepreneurs and guiding institutions who are really necessary to, as TJ was saying, push the agenda for L1-based MLE. And these are in all of our cases and country cases, we've seen that these are mainly academics or linguists or local NGO leaders, sometimes government officials who are really pushing the agenda for first language use in education. And how do they do that? Well, they broker coalitions, they maintain attention to the issue. Really, they're really advancing the agenda on L1 use in schools, contributing technical expertise in language development, program design, implementation, and research. And so just to get out a little bit from this abstract theorization, the case of Senegal, for example, which is a high priority case, it's a high priority because in Senegal, in April of 2021, the government of Senegal adopted a national bilingual education policy reform called the MOEBS, Modèle Harmonisé de l'Enseignement Bilingue au Sénégal. And when we did the process tracing, we saw in our data that these academics, linguists, or local NGOs, and that was also a part of my dissertation, but these policy entrepreneurs called themselves these militants of national languages, of these African endogenous languages within Senegal. And they were the ones since maybe even prior to independence and post-independence are advocating for the legitimacy of African languages, or national languages, to be a legitimate language in use in administration, in education. So they were very instrumental in pushing forward the legitimization of national languages in constitution. They pushed the first two government pilots that were initiated, well, as early as 1977, the first try and the second try in 2002 and 2008, and they were not entirely successful, but they were the ones that really were behind to make sure that the L1s were used in these education systems. And really their power in some ways, or their push, it was is really widespread to the point that the ministry, one senior official of the Ministry of Education was saying it's really a social dynamic, it's academics, it's members of the parliament, it's government, people, everyone's really talking about the L1s, and this is really credit to the work that they do in pushing the agenda for L1-based MLE. And we've seen similar things happen also in Mali and Mozambique. For example, in Mali, because the government is more centralized, there were mainly government officials that were pushing for this L1-based MLE since the early 80s as well. And we also see in Mozambique, academics, university professor at the University of Eduardo Mondlane that are really part of this since its beginning and pushing this agenda forward. In the second condition, the second condition for L1-based MLE political prioritization is feasibility. And our data showed that proofs of concept demonstrate feasibility. So proofs of concept is really what TJ earlier was mentioning. These pilot programs from local NGOs, governments, sometimes supported by international organizations that show a clear path, the pathway for L1-based MLE. By piloting bilingual education or any L1-based type of education. And because of their implementation really overcomes these concerns about implementation difficulty. It's really a little bit about this, what people say, seeing is believing. A lot of people, stakeholders really need to see it happen in their context to know that this is feasible and we can do this. And so, again, taking the case of Senegal, which is a high political prioritization, one key NGO called ARED, Associates in Research and Education for Development, which is Senegalese run. We have with key informants was really saying, paraphrasing Ministry of Education officials saying that really ARED showed the way. Other people say that it is now irreversible, meaning we can't go back to a time where there was no bilingual education. Or another senior official was also telling us ARED's intervention facilitated the understanding of the coexistence between the L1 and the L2. So really, this is like the moment where everyone's like, this can happen. We can do this. And we see that this is really what's sort of like the key to L1-based MLE being politically prioritized by the government. And condition 3 here was agenda salience and attention. And so usually what happens is that once these types of successful pilots operate, these savvy policy entrepreneurs or these militants, and using again the case of Senegal, really used the results of these pilots, the evaluation reports or so, to bring attention and create this momentum and this heat around L1-based MLE. So in the case of Senegal, there was a saturation of, after the second government initiated pilot in 2002 and 2008. Really, after that, it was really all these NGOs, civil society organizations taking the lead in implementing L1-based MLE. And there was sort of tons of pilots. So there was a kind of a saturation of pilot programs. And ARED's, coming back to that key NGO's role, ARED's program, bilingual education program, which they've had implemented in over 100 classrooms in Wolof French, Pulaar French, started to gain a lot of attention and traction, especially because I think the executive sort of management body of ARED, the leaders of ARED are particularly savvy in that sense that they brought attention by disseminating their results of their evaluation back in 2019 in a very public setting, inviting all stakeholders from the ministry, parents, teachers, media, that it really started to gain attention. And that really was a tipping point to push the ministry to consolidate a national model. And they held, after that, series of workshops, one in particular in Sali, where all these different programs and implementers were gathered to discuss about, well, what is the model that Senegal is going to adopt here and move forward in scaling. And so this is really an example of how the heat is generated and for political prioritization and bring attention to this. And then we see then that this is these three conditions together really pushed the high political prioritization in the case of Senegal. Great.
Can I just add a
Yes.
two-finger?
Yes.
Erina, so I'm just thinking of like another example of heat getting generated. I think a lot of the examples were kind of, we call them generated focusing events, where people actually were trying to create the heat intentionally and were savvy and strategic about how to do so. In at least one of the cases, that's not always the case. And I think Mali gives a good example. Part of the heat was generated probably by people and with some intentionality. Even the workshop that we hosted for lights seemed to like contribute to the attention rise, at least according to our local team from Mali, who said this was kind of catching hold and garnering more attention. The workshop that the systems thinking workshop we held at the beginning of the light study. But also the geopolitics at the time in Mali were important. There was conflict. There was difficulty with the French military, who at the time had a force in Mali, and then because of tensions with the regime that was in charge in Mali at the time, the French military pulled out, and it was kind of a high tension point in diplomatic relations between the French and the Malian government, which interestingly shined a lot more attention on national languages in Mali, and it seems to have that really seemed to like help the heat on this issue. Now, there was also this long history of success of bilingual education in Mali and had been growing steadily. But why at that moment did this catch hold and then suddenly become a national priority and scale nationally in Mali? It seems like this geopolitical thing, which was not a generated focusing event. It was kind of unrelated in a lot of ways to L1-based MLE, but it helped add heat, which then seems to have been part of the conditions that then pushed it forward in the end. Okay, last slide here, and then we'll open it up for discussion. We're really looking forward to talking to you more about this. This is just to say this is again the case of Senegal, but altogether. And one of the other things that's interesting, we think that there's a time dimension to this. It seems that in most stories, the political mobilization comes first and really sets the foundation and the groundwork to even get this on the agenda and starting to be considered a legitimate issue. But the feasibility, we saw this again most clearly in Senegal, but I think this is true in many of the cases. The feasibility was really the linchpin. It was kind of, we called it like a fulcrum cause or like this kind of key cause that once that flipped, the momentum really moved. So you see mobilization in Senegal for like 50 years and then multiple pilots that didn't really work enough to convince decision makers that implementation was possible. And there was pretty strong anecdotes of debates before the civil society pilots where decision makers were saying, yeah, we want this. We believe you. We just don't know if it's feasible. Can we do it? Can we make it work? So this was really a hang up. And then once the successful civil society pilots, and there was the RED one most importantly, but a couple others as well, that really flipped the switch. And then things accelerated. It wasn't by itself enough. So I like to say kind of evidence doesn't necessarily speak for itself. People have to promote it. They have to then still create the heat to kind of consolidate the political will. We're using this language of like a threshold. So the attention and the salience is like, moving from this momentum, capturing it, harnessing it, spreading it. So there's enough people in among the elites and among the public that people can't ignore this anymore. And it's like politically more expensive to stand on the sidelines and not pay attention to this. And it's like politically more beneficial to jump in and say, yeah, we agree with this thing. So the heat, I think, creates the pull and the kind of growing consensus to move forward. But we tended to see this sequentially. Mobilization, then feasibility, then heat, and then movement. So last quick slide, and then I'm going to turn it over to Carol, and maybe I'll just leave this on here and maybe mention one or two things. This point four is the one I just made. This idea that all the things have to come together, I think, is really important for us. And and this is just kind of for fun as a parting comment, that interestingly, we see feasibility as, yes, kind of a technical thing, but it's actually really more of a political, or at least also very heavily a political thing. And there's some really interesting ways we saw this, that the narrative about feasibility was as important, if not more important, than the actual technical work. And you see this in a very particular way with the kind of late politics leading to the overturning of MTBMLE in the Philippines, where it's really these infeasibility narratives that get created. And you can see that this is largely a framing exercise, because it's still really open whether you could just work on improving the situation in the Philippines or if it should be overturned. And that's a political decision, and that had kind of political storytelling that was happening around it. So feasibility is this like very live and co-constructed political reality that's linked to technical things, but it's not only about technical things. So anyways, with that, we'll turn it over to Carol. Super excited to hear folks' thoughts and questions, and have a lively discussion for the next 40 minutes or so.
Thank you so much, Erina and TJ, for this really thought-provoking webinar, and especially in light of the January conversations about change from above, from below, and from the side. I can see all of these interactions between the models, but I think what you bring to this is really it's really great, because you're bringing a sort of different way of thinking about the data and finding similar things, but also giving us a lot of insights. So thank you so much. I see a lot of appreciation coming from the audience. And I hope the audience are actually participants. We haven't seen any questions in the chat yet. So please let us know by either raising your hand or letting us know in the chat if you have a question you'd like to ask the presenters. And maybe I'll start with, I was wondering how you decided on the methods to begin with. I guess this is a TJ question, because Erina wasn't yet, she came in to help you pull everything together once you got the data. But could you talk a little bit about how you decided about the methods? And TJ, also maybe a little bit about your trajectory learning about L1-based MLE.
Yeah, sure. Fun stories about that, Carol, and I'm happy to tell. Um, so this is just like a little bit of a quick anecdote to tell the method story. So the methods did evolve just in general for the LITE study, which had 5 research questions in 6 countries, which is almost like 30 studies. It was very big, and it took us a long time. But this was one of the research questions. It wasn't one. There was USAID wanted us to think about, they were framing this as kind of like a political economy question. But my initial thinking was really zeroed in on the implementation complexity of how to do this, and looking for where it might be breaking down or succeeding or failing. Kind of assuming that that's where maybe the interesting stories were lying. And so I had developed these kind of complex. Maybe you're getting the picture that I like these complex like causal bubble maps, So I was drawing all these complex bubble maps of like material creation and teacher training, and the sequence of each kind of value chain, if you will, of how MTBMLE or L1-based MLE needs to be implemented from the highest levels down to the implementation in the classroom. And I shared them with a friend who's an experienced kind of actor in this space, and a friend and mentor of mine, Penelope Bender. And I said, Penelope, can you take a look at these? I'd be curious to see your feedback. To what extent is this make sense? We were just kind of framing the questions and trying to say, where should we be looking here? And at the beginning there was I think 4 or 5 of these little causal models, theory models. And the first bubble, the first box on each one said political will. Okay. And then everything kind of flowed after. And Penelope's quick response was very funny to me. She said, yeah, TJ, we know all that. The question is, what's to the left of political will? We don't know that, and that would be really interesting. And I said, "Oh my gosh, that's a really interesting question." I make a point. I'll tell this. I make a point of whenever Penelope's right, following her advice, and she's usually right. So I'm often following Penelope's advice. So we were like, yes, we should make that a focus of the question. And she pointed us to Shiffman. And so we then read a bunch of Shiffman stuff, and we were like, okay, we like Shiffman. And then Shiffman was the one who was talking about process tracing. At the same time, I had just read the report from the Learning at Scale report that RTI did about what explains the success of scalable foundational learning programs, and they used process tracing as part of their inquiry as well. So I started to see it in a couple different interesting places, and I started reading up about it and was really curious, and then was convinced that it seemed like a method that was useful for political questions. So scholars would talk about how this where you can't do a randomized control trial because it's just hard to randomize politics, and it's a very complex, multifaceted kind of emergent phenomenon. That this is a really good, rigorous method to try to make some kind of causal claims in a very different way than in quantitative research, but that is still that had gained a lot of momentum in political science and some momentum in sociology. So I think it was like one part learning about it and being fascinated, one part being convinced that this was like a method that seemed to make sense for this kind of question, and then yeah, wanting to kind of give it a try. And I've really enjoyed learning it from it, and I'm pretty convinced that it's a cool method, and I find myself using it in other spaces now, and think causal qualitative research is really interesting. So. In terms of your question about my own journey on L1-based MLE, so I'm a I'm a I'm like an ed policy scholar, and I do most of my research before this in a kind of analogous space was in early grade reading, and in particular in kind of scaling early grade reading models and like continuous improvement and how to make them work and how to make them work better. So kind of evaluating and continuous improvement starting in Haiti. And so it was essentially an early phase L1-based MLE model in Haiti that we were working on, but with a focus on early grade reading, not necessarily a broader curriculum initiative. So and I wasn't as focused on the linguistic aspects of it. I mean, knew that there were benefits to L1 reading and kind of knew the basic literature about that, but there was a big learning curve for me. And one of the things that I found, I think we talked about this once, Carol, but one of the things that I found is the literature is really vast, and there's multiple literatures. There's like the psycholinguistics literature from psychology. There's the literacy and reading literature that touches upon multilingual dynamics, second language learners and stuff. And then there's like the bilingual ed scholars and the language policy and planning scholars and the linguists, the applied linguists. And navigating all of those and how they were similar and different from each other was like, it was a very, I feel like I got another PhD in this over the course of the 2 years of doing the light study. And I will just say, like, at the end, I was somewhat surprised to realize that there are really clear evidence about preferred models, but it was hard for me to learn that. It took a long time to figure that out. So it tells me that those some of those things are known but not well disseminated or understood, and there's a lot of like I think confusion in between some of the different in some of the different research communities and kind of maybe not like a perfect consolidation of talking to each other. So it's been a great learning journey. Once I really understood it deeply, I told Carol once in a past call, I feel like I took the red pill in the Matrix, and now I can't like unsee
Yay.
how important this is. And I'm like, how have you been living for 30 years knowing that this is nobody's doing the thing that works, and it's such a big deal. So yeah, I'm a total convert now of the importance of this, and it's been a pleasure to work on it. I think it's really important work.
Thank you. That may show also how difficult it is sometimes for people to understand, to wrap their heads around the idea that the L1 is important for L2 learning. It seems so basic for a lot of us, but it's not a direct logic line for a lot of people. So,
Sometimes
Erina, do you want to add anything to that? And then we have some questions now that we can start looking at.
Yeah. Though it's been a pleasure also to learn a lot more about causal qualitative research, and I think the possibilities that this brings to maybe push a little bit language policy and planning folks to look into more poli-sci literature, political science literature, or public policy even, because education is after all a public policy, and to sort of create these methodological or disciplinary bridges and be able to consolidate a stronger argument for L1-based MLE. And I thought this is like, so in that sense, it was really compelling. And I had started to touch upon that with the, in my dissertation, I used the multiple streams approach by Kingdon, sort of seeing the policy problem and politics stream. But it's been very fascinating to use the methodology and sort of, yeah, I like detective stories. So that's sort of being able to do that on things that you care and you're interested in has been really, really fascinating. And I hope it encourages other people to look at process tracing as well as a type of methodology to maybe apply in their own context, and be very happy to talk with other people on this. Yeah.
Yeah, it's nice to have these research partnerships too, where you're really learning from each other and then integrating each other's epistemologies and methodologies into your work. So we're very happy this has been so fruitful. I wonder if we can just go down. One of the first questions we got was about just asking for more details. It's from Ana Isabel Garcia Abellan about the workshops themselves and how they were done. And I thought that too when you were talking. I know we didn't have a lot of time, but maybe even talk about the languages that were used and the research assistants that you had.
Yeah. So this was something we were doing across the studies for SHARE, which was the grant that we had from USAID that stands for Supporting Holistic and Actionable Research and Education. And it was to advance some of the learning agenda for USAID's education portfolio across countries. And there was a real interest in understanding like what the grant was calling evidence ecosystem. So not just how to produce new research, but how to make sure it's actually like leading to decision making and kind of fitting into an ongoing policy group. It was really resonant in a lot of ways with kind of this kind of study of like the politics of evidence-based work, right? How does it actually translate or transition into implementation? So one of the ideas we had was like really robust participatory work at the beginning of the study to both help us inform our design and our understanding of the policy context, but also to get a lot of interest from key decision makers and key actors within the countries right from the outset and throughout the study period. So, and we leaned on systems thinking. Basically, the workshops were for the most part divided into two main periods or two main kind of questions. One was like diagnosing the current reality of the system. So sometimes systems thinking folks call this like seeing the system, and it had to do with visualizing what was there. We used something called like a root cause analysis or a fishbone diagram. So in small groups of mixed kind of, so we would want to like not have all the ministry people sitting at the same table together, but there'd be like a local teacher and like a representative of like a local community or indigenous community plus a ministry person plus a scholar or whatever, and they'd be at the table together. So different perspectives, different voices, and in maybe tables of 5 to 6 people or 5 to 7 people, they would construct and visualize. Everybody would brainstorm these kind of root causes of what's going on in that's leading to the current kind of policy conditions in the country and try to explain that. And then the group kind of sense makes together based on everybody's input, and they kind of organize their thinking in these root causes into this map. The fishbone diagram is kind of shaped like the bones of a fish, so it kind of shows the causes and subcauses and strands of subcauses. We also asked, because we were kind of moving into this idea of like what is not just people's perception, but based on what evidence or what kind of strength of evidence, we asked people not only to kind of express what they thought was happening, but how they knew that. Like based on what evidence are you saying that this is a root cause? And so that was like one of the major artifacts. Both we had note takers in each of those small groups, and then we collected their fishbone diagrams and the evidence that they pointed to. And then in the second half of the workshop, it was really like moving towards a little more sense making about solutions, both in general for the policy community, but also to kind of inform our research. So like we tried to get some good advice about, particularly important phenomena that we needed to zero in and try to understand each of those country contexts. And so and then there was shared plenary sessions that everybody had these small groups, and then we'd do gallery walks. You could look at other people's groups, and then we'd post them on the walls, and people would present out and talk about them. And there was some kind of effort to aggregate the findings across the group. So I think they were really great. It's really interesting work. Systems thinking work, I think, is a really helpful analytic tool, especially in these big complex problems. So yeah, maybe that's enough.
How did you manage the languages involved?
Oh, yeah, it depended. Like in the Philippines, it was interesting. It was very mixed between Tagalog and English and very fluid. In most of the other countries, most of the people that were there were English speakers, but we often or like second language speakers. We often navigated this in dialogue with our local research partner to ensure sensitivity to we wanted diverse representation of different types of people from society, but we kind of deferred to the local actors about how best to navigate language interpretation and things like that. So I think I think the Philippines, we had the most non-English speaking workshop. I actually wasn't in every workshop, so I think in Mali it was mostly in French. In Mozambique it was mostly in Portuguese. But I think it was a bit on a case-by-case basis, and our local research teams had a big role in determining how to navigate those spaces.
I can speak for the Senegal workshop because I was there. I just happened to be there when Amy and Maria were there, and it was mainly in so they had translation booth with people translating for certain parts because the facilitator was it Ran? I think somebody from Ran. So who was English speaking. So they had from Kenya. So then they had a translation into French. And then in each of these groups that I was walking around, they were all talking in whatever language they were comfortable doing it. But then somebody was note taking in French for doing the presentation. And then once they understood how it was facilitated, it just happened all automatically in each group designated one person who would present. So it was kind of like that I saw the workshops happening.
So there was some national language use,
yes,
Wolof.
Yes, yeah. Because they were brainstorming
talking
with each other, and then maybe one who was more proficient in French to present at the end, but they were writing it. But that was how I observed the workshops happening in Senegal.
Yeah, that's a methodological concern and a thing to be aware of too, is who is actually giving us information. So just wanted to clarify that.
And I will say those workshops were mostly with kind of like elites, I would say broadly, kind of they were academics, they were NGO leaders, they were we had like a parent association representative, but she was like the president of the parent association. So there was some educators present, but by and large, this wasn't like a super grassroots body of representatives. It was diverse, but mostly of kind of leadership positions in society.
Yeah, that's one of the questions that Kimmo Kosonen and I have been asked about our using our change from above, change from the side, and change from below, is that we're not getting a lot of voices from below all the time. So anyway, it was just it's not a criticism, but just a noticing factor that we as researchers may need to find additional ways to get information from that level. I want to go to Kate Shell, who has a question for you, and I'd love it if you asked it, Kate, because it's kind of long.
Yeah, sorry.
Thanks.
I thought it was going to be short, and then I ended up writing a small novel. But anyway, yeah, this is all super interesting, and this discussion around participatory research methods, is kind of what I'm thinking of when you're describing the process you followed, and navigating multiple languages is fascinating. I feel like that could be a whole session on its own. But I'm interested in the kind of political science lens because that's not as familiar to me. I mean, I have policy background, but the political science angle is really interesting. And I'm curious about whether and how you differentiate between the kind of stated political priorities or political speech versus political actors' actual motivations or priorities. And I started thinking about this when you referenced the congressional hearings in the Philippines, which I also read the transcripts because they happened like in the middle of the night in the US. So I only watched a few sections of it, but reading those transcripts, I was often thinking like, okay, these are the questions they're asking, right? But a congressional hearing is a form of political speech. Like they're asking questions perhaps because they're genuinely interested in the answers, but they're also asking specific questions to make a specific point. It's a kind of posturing as well, right? So it's part of what you were talking about at the end, that kind of political storytelling that's happening. And so I'm curious, like, how do you disentangle when you're analyzing this data, the kind of political storytelling around what are the reasons, for example, for deprioritizing first language in the Philippines versus the kind of underlying priorities or motivations of those with political power and voice? Can we disentangle those? Does it matter to disentangle those when it comes to the outcomes? So,
Yeah. Yeah, great. Happy to hear Erina's thoughts on this too, but maybe I can take a quick first stab. Kate, I love this question. I think it's such a good one. Maybe just talk about two different dimensions here. One is in the initial evaluation of the degree of priority that I think is an important consideration because we want that to be pretty accurate, right? So to what extent, and Shiffman's criteria is actually to what extent do decision makers kind of emphasize the importance of the issue or the policy in public and private speech? So the private part there is, I think, pretty important because it gets around some of the posturing stuff that is there, um, including also, and like the more you dig and the more you talk to the right people and the more you can get like honest, trusted conversations from people, if like with good interviews, like I think it's an interviewing skill to be able to kind of like peel back that first layer of political posturing when you're, especially when you're talking to a political type person. But there is pretty clear evidence, for example, in Kenya that political leaders equivocate, or political scientists call this strategic communication. So they like placate their audience. So depending who they're talking to, they're like, oh yeah, we have a policy for L1 based stuff. And then when they're talking to someone else, they're like, don't worry about that policy. We're not implementing it at all. So same politician, different audiences, different messages. But I think we got really good data that politicians do that in Kenya. So like it's getting underneath that, or even politicians saying, they might start the conversation with me as a foreign academic, talking, pointing to the policy, but then pushing them a little bit to be like, but come on, is this really, and then getting to a more real conversation with them, and why that's happening, and then it changes the conversation. So I think having a good, accurate view of like how deep and real is the speech among decision makers and how pervasive is it in the context for the initial evaluation to say yes or no high priority, and then how to trust the integrity of what they're saying. I think the hearings in the Philippines were like this great example of this. Um, I'll give like one anecdote. There's probably many that I could mention, but one anecdote that was particularly like perfect for this to my we talk about this in the paper a little bit from our case study of the Philippines, but one of the reasons given for the infeasibility of L1-based MLE, so MTB MLE in the Philippines in the congressional hearings was the fact that this worked better when supported by donors, by international donors. So like even the successes of the USAID supported region or the World Bank supported region were twisted by the politicians to then be a sign of failure of the ministry and a sign of fragility of the policy. So they kind of twisted what could be a proof of concept instead to then tell a story of fragility. That to me is a great example of what seems like what was already had happened in the Philippines was the attention had turned very negative, and the politicians were now legitimizing what was a foregone conclusion. Now, that's a little hard to say, you've got to construct the situation, the context, and interpret what's happening based on a variety of factors. And I think we try to do that. Like the president comes out against this. This mobilizes other actors. They start changing their tune. Very few people are defending it. And then you have this pageantry of the hearings. So not some of, I think, what is said in the hearings do ring authentically. Like at one point, the senator leading the hearing says, if we only had an RCT pointing to this, it would be easier to defend. I kind of think he's being real there. And then when he's talking about this, like the wins being failures at the same time, I'm like, okay, that just smacks of like kind of manipulating the story for for the narrative you want to tell. I don't know. I guess we need to use caution when we're interpreting that way because it's a little unclear. But I think using context and using our understanding of the way politicians work can allow us to try to tease out what's real there. I don't know. Anything to add? Sorry, I went on long.
No, I think that's exactly right. And I think sometimes it's really with political speech, I think the double speak is so prevalent. So being able to really isolate what is the true motivation versus what they're publicly facing. But I think in the Philippines data, we see that pretty clearly, how they manipulate certain things that MTB-MLE folks have been advocating and then utilizing that, instrumentalizing that against. And I think that's how you see that it's really a political game that's happening. And one has to be somehow of a political animal, and maybe in the sphere we don't want to be like that, but maybe, but in cases where we want to advance certain policies, maybe that's where that savviness is a little needed to push forward. But yeah, I think it has to be, one has to be a little cautious when looking at political speech, and I guess that's why you need a little more accumulation of evidence and who said what when, in with whom, and then kind of see is that coherent and throughout time, or are they talking to other people in different ways?
Thanks. And I just wanted to take this opportunity to show that we have invited Ched Arcedon and Ricardo Nolasco to speak in March on the 18th. So we'll be going into the Philippines case a little bit more. And everybody's been thinking about this, how does policy change? How does it go one direction or the other? So this is coming. We have another question from Karsten Van Riesen. Karsten, would you like to ask it yourself?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. Are you hear me okay?
Yes, thanks.
Yeah, good to hear this very interesting research, well grounded. That makes it very interesting also. Yeah, my question is based on practice. We have been working about 2 years now on setting up a consortium in India with several civil society organizations, some academics, some UN agencies, all that, to see if we can together join forces to help the government to implement the policy that is there for multilingual education. Now, this research seemed to affirm that is probably not a bad move, if I understand it right. Do you folks, because it seems to fit under political mobilization, if I understood your presentation correct. So I was wondering if the research has any advice for us as a consortium on what we should do or not do to actually make really a dent in our goal.
Great. I'm going to Erina, you should talk first about this. You've studied actors most.
That's a great question. I think, do we have recommendations? That's really hard to give recommendations, but what we see over and over is basically maybe I think the perseverance and tenacity of people to keep the agenda on, and finding these ways to communicate with the decision makers, right, on the benefits, and maybe that comes to the point of like sometimes people don't even understand the fact that L1, the use of the L1 is what supports the students' learning and even contributes to L2 gains. So I think it's finding a way also to disseminate this evidence base or all these confirmatory studies that we already have about the advantages and benefits of L1, and finding what is the best way to approach and what would make them these decision makers understanding. And I think one has to take, it's a little bit of trial and error in some ways, like, do you go straight into feasibility, or do you try to gather as many, map out the stakeholders and the actors that would be more susceptible to hearing this first, and then build up along the chain of power to see who else would have the ears to listen to this and would have enough, also some kind of authority or some political standing within the community or within the region to be like, well, this is maybe the way to go, and have endorsements and such. So I think it's these policy entrepreneurs are really something. And I think it takes a certain type of person to be able to navigate all of this, and to rally the troops in some ways, communicate effectively without alienating others, and finding that way to move it forward is what we've noticed in sort of some of those people that really push the agenda forward. Yeah. And I don't know if TJ, you had something else to add.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with everything Erina said, and I think this kind of role of their kind of coalition building and relationship building and networking, and I think of the most successful actors in the stories that we've seen, they're often people who have kind of standing or reputation. They're often really great people. Like think of Mamadou at Ared, who's just this lovely person, but also was really good at advocacy and really good at relationship building and trust building with government leaders. Um, Kind of a very credible witness. There's some storytelling about like senior academics presenting in front of parliament in Mozambique in a really convincing speech. Also, like the framing matters. So we found, for example, the academic framing matter we thought had more traction than like language rights framing. And that also, even interestingly, the L2 problem framing of like L2s leading to dropouts. L2 immersions leading to dropouts was really seemed to resonate in Senegal and Mozambique. So sometimes just like, what's going to have the most kind of purchase in terms of storytelling to a lay audience that doesn't have the time or interest in understanding what transfer theory it means and is, and like, you get lost in the details. Um, maybe the last thing I'll just say is it seems to me like when I think of Kenya, where a context I'm very familiar with, and what it would take to move the needle there, with the current barriers, I almost feel like you need to do this coalition building and the momentum building and the push to even get to the pilot, and enough size and energy for a pilot that can be well studied, that then would have the kind of oomph to really be allowed to tell a loud feasibility impact. So I would try to like think about the steps to think, so what are these people mobilizing for, and what are the steps along the journey? And if you don't have a really kind of like hard hitting proof of concept, maybe I would advocate for that, because then that's what's going to propel you further. And it looks like in most of our stories is really important, if it's not there. And I think it overcomes a lot of the other barriers. But even getting to the pilot phase is like getting your foot on the first couple rungs of the ladder, and requires, I think, advocacy to get that far. So I'll just add that.
Thank you. Very
Thank
helpful.
you. Thanks for the question. We have another question from Kelsey, who wants to take us to Mozambique. So I think it's good to have another case come up here. So Kelsey, could you ask your question?
Oh, yes. Yeah, this is more of a maybe a question and a reflection. And thank you both so much for your engaging presentation. I think Mozambique is a really interesting case because what we've been seeing most recently is that there is now pushback from the Ministry of Education and Culture on bi and multilingual education, especially after the dismantling of USAID and other large donor-funded projects. It seems like the political stance on bi and multilingual education is shifting backwards, perhaps, like if we think about a linguistic pendulum. And so I would like to hear from you both in your reflections on how, we navigate something like this. We see from the academics and researchers at the University of Eduardo Milane, that they're still very engaged and, acting as these side actors to continue the advocacy. But we've also seen this sort of change in political stance around this topic.
Hmm. Do you have a theory, Kelsey, about why it's changing, other than the loss of USAID funding? If there's any other kind of catalysts from your perspective? I mean, there's a little bit of maybe breadcrumbs from our case work that I could theorize, but you've been engaged there a little more recently. Anything to add?
I think we're still navigating that. It's really tricky, and it seems that I don't know if it's more of a personal thing of the person in power, the Minister of Education, or if there are some underlying other reasons. But it's just been really, yeah, just interesting to see this unfold. We know that Mozambique has been one of the leading countries in this space. And we know that there are other folks like Armindo Ngunga, Feliciano, who are really trying to advocate and push and move this forward. But there seems to be a lot more resistance than there has been in the past. I think it requires further investigation.
I have a theory I can offer. Erina, do you wanna, or do you want me to? I think I would probably point to three things. They never seemed, we called it an emerging priority in Mozambique, and from our colleagues and from the evidence, it seemed like it hadn't fully consolidated. Even within the ministry, there were some oppositional voices, though it was gaining momentum. Um, I wonder if the proofs of concept are clear and compelling enough. So I wonder if the evidence base is really strong, because I think if when you get these contested situations, like leaning back on that becomes really important. Um, so curious about that, especially what we found in Senegal when you could point to the L2 outcomes being stronger than the L2 immersion. That was like the key it was a really strong proof point. I think because there's this lingering feeling that L2 immersion is actually better at second language acquisition. So if you can point to that, as we could in Senegal, as our colleagues could in Senegal, and Carol and others help point out. But I actually also suspect, and this may be a little of a kind of a strong claim, but this is something that Erina and I were talking about, of like a learning of mine, kind of back to your question at the beginning, Carol, of like a lights, or kind of a global lights learning. I don't think we saw any of our 6 cases that reflected what the evidence would say is the design that is optimal being implemented well. So 6 years of bilingual education with materials and training and support, late exit, but also meaningfully bilingual the whole time. And I don't think we have any examples of that. Mali's close, but it was so poorly implemented because of the governance crisis. Mozambique, so this is maybe my bold claim. I think Mozambique's policy design is problematic. I think there's many linguistic cliffs because you don't introduce L2 across the curriculum early enough. And so you switch to in 3rd grade or 4th grade in math, and suddenly you're learning math and Portuguese for the first time, and you don't have any of the math vocabulary knowledge. So because it's not a bilingual, it's a transitional model, which I know Carol would join me in being concerned about. Uh, I think that's creating weak L2 mastery comparatively, and many linguistic cliffs that are both hurting L2 acquisition, but probably also hurting learning when each of those cliffs happen. And it's leading to these hesitancies about, is this actually better? And I think those might be fairly well grounded. So if you don't get the design right, if you don't have the evidence to back it up, these are going to be lingering questions. The last thing I'll just say is they're not implementing the 4th grade. They're implementation gaps that are because of funding and government buy-in that are linked, that are like they're not fully implementing it, and that's eroding some confidence. But I wonder if the design issue isn't bigger than the implementation issue, personally. Curious to hear. You guys both know a ton
Really
about this.
interesting. Go
And
ahead, Erina. We have 5 minutes and one more question.
Yeah.
So Just
And I would second you on this because I think in the case of Senegal, or they did do a concurrent bilingual all the way through sixth grade, even though it's not something that it was piloted by the NGO and it's shown the results at the end of sixth grade that these students are able to. So it's again late exit versus early exit, and then the more we hunker down on early exit models, it creates these hesitancies, I think, and it's a matter of pushing does that hurdle away so people understand that it's the results, you only see it after 6 years or more of effective exposure to L1 and L2. So something about that also with Mozambique we see. All right.
Thank you. That's a really important point, and we're just starting to see these stronger models coming. But we also have in Senegal, that experimentation was a good model, and it's hopefully influencing policy. But then there are these other conditions, right? Like you have to have trained teachers, you have to have materials that go all the way through primary school. So there are logistical challenges to that. Let me just ask, because Ian Cheffy has been waiting to ask a question, and we're hoping to get it in. I think we can go over a little bit, and anyone who needs to leave.
It won't take long, Carol. Firstly,
Okay.
thanks very much,
Thank
TJ
you.
and Erina. As you may have seen in the chat, I'd like to continue the focus on resistance, which is interesting. We've been talking about quite a bit today. You've mentioned how political leaders can sort of start a movement of resistance for whatever reason. Um, does it ever happen that actually resistance to positive policies come up from the grassroots, from parents? Or does it come from, or can it come from other sources? So, what is going on here that the resistance starts to build? Can you comment further than what you've already said today?
Erina, do you want to go first?
Yeah, so the resistance in the sense that that lead to reversal, is that
Yeah.
what is that? So the resistance that gets generated in reversal. Well, this was most, I think, prominent in the Philippines case for us because that's the most recent reversal that we've documented or we looked at. And where does it come from? I mean, I think it's mainly. I think it was, I don't know, it feels to me it was more of a scapegoating exercise there, in trying to, and also kind of coincided with a political transition time where a very favorable president for MTB-MLE went out of office, and then it turned into some other president. And then I think within the DepEd, the Department of Education, I don't know how strongly MTB-MLE was consolidated in a sense, and a lot of blaming on the shortcomings of the implementation. Like the implementation was not done well. We don't have the proper evidence, and so like I think the political winds kind of capitalize on that to poke at it. I don't know if we see parents' resistance that much. They just say, parents do say that we didn't know the difference between bilingual education, which was Tagalog English, and MTB-MLE. So they keep saying that they were not informed, blah, blah, blah. The opposition put on the stand a parent from, just complaining about these kind of things. Now, I don't know if it's a genuine thing, if it's been politically motivated to utilize them. There were teachers that were sort of like also, so I think in some ways, quality of implementation matters in the pilot programs, or because even also teachers were like, we were left to our own devices. We didn't know how to implement this bilingual model. So in some ways, I think that comes to questions of implementation. But I don't know, TJ, if you would add other things. I don't know if there's like genuine opposition just coming out from parents, but.
Yeah, I think the Philippines is an interesting case, but we could point to at least with two other examples. I would agree with you that to me, implementation is the root cause. and design. So I think if you compare and contrast the RED case study and how parents and teachers react to that, well implemented, 6-year bilingual, all the books, all the training, fully, thoroughly done. It unleashed demand. People loved it. And that actually sends a really powerful political signal to politicians, which they want people to love it. If they are worried that parents are going to resist or be ambivalent about it, they don't want to take the risk. So there's both, I think the RED case was powerful because it both showed the technical solution working better than L2 immersion, but also it showed the political benefits of a well-implemented bilingual model, and that it was not only palatable to parents and teachers, but preferable. People want, there was, and Carol talks about this in her paper, but that there's like teachers that were part of the counterfactual group were saying, could we do this too? And parents were saying, well, how do I get that? It created buzz in a positive way. In contrast, the Philippines, which in my opinion scaled wildly too fast and like without being really ready in all these languages, like there were linguistic gaps, there were like the materials weren't ready, the system wasn't ready, and and I think Carol's been really wise in the past to encourage systems to go slow and use more opt-in approaches and use more gradual rollouts to get the implementation right, because otherwise I think it creates these negative feedback loops where there's a certain degree of ambivalence at best or actual frustration at worst, either because you don't believe in this yet and you're forced to do it, or because you see it happening and you see all these problems. Like there was a great comment in the workshop where my colleague and I were really marveling that they were like, the version of this local language that you're using in the school isn't what I speak at home. It's not my L1. And they take the takeaway that my colleague and I had was like, the L1 isn't the L1. Like, what does this even mean? But if you don't have a stable L1 language that is now socially accepted and you push it too fast, you get all there was lots of points of friction when you send a school the wrong books and now they're learning someone else's L1. When you have an L1 version that's wrong and feels wrong to a community and isn't socially acceptable, when the teachers aren't trained, when the design isn't actually giving either enough L1 or enough L2. And so you're kind of compromising the optimal design at both sides. It doesn't kind of click for frontline people the way, both parents and teachers, I think, the way it does when you get the design and the implementation right. So I do think, I would just say, Ian, I do think those frontline actors that was bubbling up in the system, and that what happened with the political transition seems like political entrepreneurial, like there was a political opportunity to capitalize on frustration, and that president came in and just seized it. uh so politicians are, Carol, you asked a question even before this that we didn't get to, but like I think the actors from above are actually more reactive than proactive. They're reading the room, so to speak. They're reacting to the politics that are flowing up in the system. And if the politics start to turn and they're hearing frustration in the people, they're going to react to that. They're not generally going way out on a limb to do something radical. They're going to capture where the momentum lies because that's in their self-interest.
Yeah. Great. Thank you both very much indeed. Very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for the great questions. And since we're over anyway, TJ and Erina, do you want to say anything else in conclusion? There's still a lot more discussion we could be having, and I know that we'll have some of it at the annual meeting of the Comparative and International Education Society in March, April. But any final words, and then we'll
Just a huge thank you to you, Carol, for this opportunity, for your thoughtful collaboration and guidance to both of us in part of this process. It's been great to work with you and continue this discussion. We're really grateful.
Thank you. Yeah, I see this as continuing, and it's super interesting models and approaches that are really contributing to all of our work. So thank you very much. Erina, final word?
Well, no, really, thank you for everyone who was here present this morning, and the great questions that came about. Also, it's also our first run to give this cross-national analysis. So we were like, is it going to be very dense and too dense for people to get it? So Thank you for the opportunity to be able to present this the first round, and we hope to continue for those who will be at CIS to continue discussions and continue refining this altogether. Yes, so looking forward to seeing you very soon.
Thank you. Okay, thanks everyone for the great presentation and great discussion. And we look forward to welcoming people to the next workshop on language and education policy and practice in the Philippines in March. So see you then. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.